Okay, so Denmark. What pops into your head when you hear the name? Probably like progressive policies, human rights, a really open, liberal society, right? But what if I told you that this very same country brought in a ban that caused this huge global firestorm, one that really seemed to, well, clash with that image? On August 1st, 2018, Denmark actually banned full face veils, specifically the niqab and the burqa in public spaces. So today we're doing a deep dive to unpack the surprising story behind that decision. We're going to explore the really complex mix of things that led to it, and take a critical look. Was this actually about safety and integration, or is there something deeper, maybe more challenging going on?
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it, how a policy that affects, such a tiny number of people can spark such a massive debate. It really forces you to look past the surface level of just what happened and try and understand the why, the bigger picture, the significance, and the law itself. Section 134C of the Danish Penal Code, I think it wasn't just symbolic, it had real consequences. The fine started at, what, 1,000 kroners for the first time, and then they could go up to 10,000 for repeat offences. That's quite something for just wearing clothing.
It really is. And just so we're clear, when we talk about these full face veils, we mostly mean the niqab, that's the one covering the face, but leaving the eyes clear, and the burqa, which covers everything, face included, often with a mesh panel for the eyes. So yeah, the big question is, how did Denmark, with this reputation for being so liberal, end up with a policy like this? It seems like such a contradiction.
The path to the ban is, well, it's a fascinating look at politics and society. It came from a center-right government, but what's really interesting is how wide the support was in Parliament. Even the Social Democrats, who normally think of as center-left, they backed it, along with parties like the right-wing Danish People's Party.
Exactly. And that broad agreement across the political spectrum is, well, it's very telling. Back in 2017, the Justice Minister, Søren Pape Poulsen, he talked about public safety, gender equality, promoting Danish values, specifically this idea that being able to see each other's faces is like a core value. But, when you look at the politics and Denmark's international image, this wide support for such a specific ban, it starts to feel less like a simple safety thing and maybe more like sending a signal about cultural boundaries. It really makes you ask, what was the real goal here, especially when you look at the numbers involved.
Oh, the numbers are just, they're genuinely eye-opening, aren't they? We're talking about a country of 5.7 million people, and the estimates are only about 150 to 200 women wore niqabs, and almost no one wore a burqa. So the idea that a national law was needed for such an incredibly tiny group, it just immediately makes you pause. With numbers that small, the whole safety argument just feels, well, pretty weak, doesn't it? So what else could possibly be driving this?
It definitely points to something more targeted than just safety. And you're right, this didn't just happen overnight. It built up over years. There was this rising anti-immigrant sentiment in Denmark, and it really got amplified after the 2015 refugee crisis. Remember, Denmark took in about 20,000 asylum seekers then, mostly from Muslim-majority countries. And public opinion polls, even back in 2017, showed something like 62% support for a ban like this. That feeling was really fueled by rhetoric from the Danish People's Party, who kept saying these veils were just, incompatible with Danish society.
And it's interesting, too, watching the politicians shift. Mette Frederiksen, she's the prime minister now, she actually spoke out against a ban in 2014. But then by 2018, she supported it. That's quite a turnaround. It signals a clear move, I think, towards those populist feelings, especially with the 2019 election coming up. Hard not to see the politics in that. And critics, well, as you'd expect, they've argued pretty strongly that this whole narrative, whether it's about Danish values or safety, is really just masking deeper racial issues.
Oh, absolutely. They point out it hits Muslim women hardest. They're about 4% of the population, maybe 22,500 people. And the law conveniently ignores other things that cover the face, like ski masks, balaclavas, things actually used more often in crimes. Plus, there's just no real security data backing it up. Only 23 fines in the whole first year. It really does undermine the safety claim. Instead, it fits this wider pattern in Europe. I think there are, 18 other countries with similar bans now, often sold as, protecting women, but usually without really talking to the women involved.
Right. So when you stack all that up, the tiny numbers, the political shifts, the shaky justifications, it leads straight to that really tough question, the core of it all. Is this ban basically racist? Now, people who support it, like Minister Poulsen, they insist it's neutral. It's about a secular value, seeing faces, communicating. They even point to exceptions, like for Halloween masks, as proof it's inclusive. But if it's so neutral, why did everyone immediately start calling it the burqa ban?
That's the key point, isn't it? The
Yeah.
popular name itself tells a story. And you had figures like Nasser Khader, he's a Muslim MP, who actually supported the ban, saying things like the veils represent oppression and, well, should be worn somewhere else. That clearly targets Islamic practices specifically. It really suggests this kind of cultural litmus test, like you have to act a certain way, adopt certain cultural norms, not just obey the law, to be seen as properly integrated or quote-unquote Danish.
Yeah.
And human rights groups like Amnesty International were very blunt. They called it a discriminatory violation. They argued it punishes women for who they are, for their identity, not for doing anything wrong.
And the legal side is fascinating, too. The European Court of Human Rights actually upheld similar bans before in France and Belgium. Those rulings, back in 2014 and 2017, mentioned something about communal harmony.
Yeah.
What did those cases establish, and why do critics say they kind of missed the point about racial implications?
Well, those rulings basically said, yes, a country can restrict religious symbols in public if it thinks it's necessary for people living together for this idea of communal harmony. But the criticism is that this idea of harmony can easily mean prioritizing the majority culture's idea of what society should look like. In Denmark, where 87.6% are ethnically Danish, it can look like prioritizing that homogenous identity over minority rights. Critics argue it's a bit like old colonial ideas of forcing people to assimilate, making everyone fit the dominant mold. And while you still see debates online, like on X in 2025, people split between calling it a brave cultural stand and racist oppression. The actual enforcement numbers tell a different story. One charge in 2022, only 23 in the first year. It really suggests the practical effect was tiny, more symbolic than anything else.
So, okay, if the real goal is supposed to be integration, successful integration, why focus so much energy on clothing, a personal choice for such a small number of women, instead of tackling the bigger systemic problems like language barriers or the fact that, according to 2023 stats, 40% of non-Western immigrants struggle with employment? It just makes you question the priorities, doesn't it? Passing a symbolic law affecting so few while these major integration hurdles remain.
That really brings up a critical point. Does focusing on something so visible, like attire, end up being a kind of racial profiling of Muslim identity? Is that whole integration narrative just, cover for exclusion?
It's a really pointed question when you think about the effect on people's lives, on society, and whether it actually builds belonging or just forces surface-level changes. Which leads us right into thinking about the long-term consequences. What kind of ripples could this ban send through Danish society, especially if it keeps developing? One big worry is making Muslim women more isolated. If they're worried about fines or just feeling unwelcome, maybe they stay home more. People were already protesting about that possibility back in 2018. And there was a study in 2019 that found reported sightings of niqabs dropped by 15% after the ban. That could hint at women retreating, becoming more confined. Which, ironically, could make gender segregation worse and actually hinder integration, creating what sociologist Margit Warburg called parallel communities.
That's a huge concern, because it completely backfires on the stated goal of integration. And think economically, too. If women feel pushed out of public life, maybe they participate less in the workforce. For Muslim women, participation is already lower, about 50% compared to 75% for Danish women overall. Fewer people working means less tax revenue, more strain on social welfare. And now there's even talk of a proposal in June 2025 to extend this ban into schools and universities. Prime Minister Frederiksen mentioned concerns about social control driving that idea. But you risk pushing students away even more. Things like removing prayer rooms have also been suggested. That could easily increase dropout rates for Muslim youth rates that were already 10% higher than average in 2024 data. It completely undermines assimilation through education.
And the legal precedent that sets. Wow. If that 2025 schools proposal goes through, it starts looking a lot like France's 2004 ban on religious symbols in schools. Where does it start? Could it eventually include hijabs, other things? It seems to normalize the state getting involved in very personal choices about expression. And ironically, it could end up weakening the very secular principles Denmark says it's defending by enforcing one specific version of secularism. Internationally, too, people pointed out back in 2018, this could make it harder for Denmark to criticize countries like Saudi Arabia on human rights. It might strain relationships with Muslim majority nations.
Absolutely. And then there's the risk of making divisions within Denmark even deeper. You see it online, the protests. It's clear society is split. Some celebrating Danish values, others calling it Islamophobic. This kind of polarization could give more oxygen to far-right groups like the Danish People's Party, Or, the flip side could be backlash from minority communities, maybe increased crime, maybe radicalization risks, although it's really important to say there's no data showing that's happened yet. Of course, the counterargument exists. Maybe if integration somehow works despite this, fewer veils could mean cultural alignment. But that's a big if, and it would surely need genuinely inclusive policies alongside it, something that doesn't seem to have been the focus.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean for you listening to this?
Well, the official story often presents this ban as, progressive, about equality, but the evidence we've looked at today, it really suggests it was more of a reaction, perhaps driven by fears about immigration. The fact that it's barely enforced and there were no real security incidents driving it, that really challenges the safety reason. It points much more towards cultural assimilation being the main goal. It really makes you pause and think about the underlying currents, doesn't it?
And it raises that fundamental question. If you try to force assimilation through laws and punishments, do you actually build unity? Or do you just breed resentment? When a policy singles out such a visible minority, one that has minimal actual impact on society day to day, well, it's hard not to see it through a racial lens. It can feel uncomfortably close to past efforts to just erase cultural differences, all in the name of progress. We have to consider the human cost. Yeah. At the end of the day, it seems like long-term success for integration, real integration, probably depends less on controlling symbols and more on tackling those root causes, things like education, jobs, language support. It's a complex picture, and it seems like maybe that nuance got overlooked in this particular policy. If you find these kinds of deep dives into complex, sometimes controversial topics interesting, you should definitely check out Mind Expansion Daily. Honestly, it's where we find incredible information and perspectives, like the kind of stuff we've been discussing today. Seriously, head over there, and while you're at it, give Mind Expansion Daily a like and subscribe. That way you won't miss out on more well-researched, often surprising insights. So our final thought for you today is this. What does this whole story about Denmark's Burqa ban really tell us? About the tricky path of integration, about identity, and about the kinds of choices societies make when they face cultural change? What actually makes a society harmonious, and how much of that harmony can or even should be enforced by law? Lots to think about there.